She threw me out onto the street the very next day after my son's funeral, coldly declaring that the house now belonged to her. And then, at the will reading, she even let out a mocking laugh. "Enjoy being homeless, Claudine." But at that very moment, the lawyer opened the sealed envelope, and everything began to turn upside down. If you're watching this video, make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Hit like if you care about stories where karma speaks louder than people ever could. And now, let me tell you how it all began, because sometimes the sharpest revenge is simply letting someone expose their true nature. Stay with me, because what happened next went far beyond anything you could imagine. Let's move on to the next part. The call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of hour when the world is so silent you can hear the clock hands pushing forward, one tiny click at a time. Jerome's voice on the other end was choked, broken, gasping as if each word was being dragged out of a chest that was collapsing inward. Mom, I don't feel right. My chest." Then click. The line went dead. I can still remember that icy rush shooting up from the soles of my feet all the way into my chest. A kind of cold that makes your heart clench. A kind of cold no blanket can warm, no prayer can soothe. I shot upright, my hands shaking so badly that buttoning my blouse took 3 attempts. Each time I missed, tears prickled behind my eyes, and only one sentence hammered through my mind. No, 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 no. Not my son. Not Jerome. On the drive to the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, my tires sliced across a road still slick with night fog. All of Philadelphia felt eerily silent, while every thought in me was frantic, crashing into the next images of last night's dinner, replayed in my mind like a film stuck on repeat. Jerome sat quietly through the entire meal, absent-mindedly turning a spoon in his hand without eating Renee, meanwhile complained non-stop about the neighbor's dog, the barking, the inconvenience, how some people have no manners. Jerome just nodded, saying nothing. He was rarely like that. Looking back now, was it a sign? Or just a long day at the logistics company? When I rushed into the ER, my heels echoed sharply on the cold tile floor, each click sounding like my own heartbeat cracking open, one piece at a time. Renee stood in the corner of the hallway, not collapsed, not trembling, not crying. The fluorescent lights overhead carved long shadows under her eyes, a face utterly composed. She looked at me, but the look was so empty, so hollow, it made the hairs on my arms rise. A doctor came out. He wore that strange, practiced calm you only see in people who have witnessed far too many deaths. His voice was flat, offering no place to hide. Massive heart attack. We did everything we could. Jerome was gone. My son, 45 years old, healthy, always jogging Sunday mornings around Rittenhouse Square, the same man who had excitedly told me about his new project at work. Now reduced to a cold name on a death certificate. I collapsed into a plastic chair in the waiting room. It felt like the whole floor tilted sideways. All the hospital sounds, paging announcements, footsteps, the soft beeping of monitors, blended into something distant, muffled, like echoes from underwater. Renee stood beside me, arms folded, her face still wearing that unnervingly steady calm. But then, just for a moment, a flicker, barely a breath, I saw something flash through her eyes. Not grief. Something else. Something that looked like relief. I blinked hard, mentally slapping myself. Impossible. No one feels relief when their husband has just died. I was spiraling. My mind was playing tricks on me. You know, there are moments in life when everything is split into 2 clear chapters, before the 3:17 a.m. call, and after it. Anyone who has lost someone suddenly will understand. In a matter of seconds, the whole world becomes foreign. You cross into a part of life you never prepared for, and never wanted, I whispered, dazed. What happens now? How was I supposed to accept that my healthy, vibrant son vanished from my life after a phone call that didn't even last 10 seconds? Renee straightened. The composure she held so tightly suddenly cracked like makeup washed off by rain. Now we have to face reality. Claudine Jerome is gone, and I have decisions to make. Her voice was so cold it sent a shiver down my spine. Renee and I had never been close. We were different in everything: temperament, values, how we saw the world. But Jerome, my son, had always been the bridge between us. Now that bridge was gone, and I began to see how wide the chasm truly was. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll get through this together," I said, reaching out to take her hand, a gesture of peace. She jerked away, so fast it was almost rude. "We'll see." I should have recognized the warning in that sentence, but at that moment, my heart was too heavy for suspicion. I reassured myself. Everyone grieves differently. Some people collapse, some freeze. Renee, clearly, was the freezing type. That night, I slept in what used to be Jerome's childhood bedroom, inside the Spruce Street home he had shared with Renee. But I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even breathe deeply. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the traffic outside. Each passing car a sharp cut to the heart. The look in Renee's eyes at the hospital kept replaying, clearer and clearer, until it felt like she was standing right in front of me. And the question I feared most crept quietly into my mind. Was that really grief? Or was it relief? The scariest part is, I was beginning to know the answer. The next 3 days drifted by like a fog-soaked nightmare, where every movement felt slowed, every sound muffled under an invisible weight. I had to arrange my son's funeral, while my mind still refused to believe Jerome was truly gone. Every time I opened the closet to choose a shirt for his memorial portrait, my eyes fell on the navy blue suit Jerome had worn to his very first job interview after graduation. Just a week ago, I had ironed it for him with my own hands. Who could have guessed that now it would be the very thing that sent me collapsing into sobs? Renee insisted on handling everything herself. Not one moment of hesitation. Not once did she ask what I wanted. She simply repeated coldly, "I'm his wife. I know what Jerome would want." I let her do as she wished, not because I trusted her, but because I was too drained to fight. I focused on writing the eulogy, calling relatives across the country, each call peeling away another piece of my heart. At 67, I had buried my parents, held my husband's hand as he took his final breath. But burying a child, that is not ordinary grief. It is hell wrapped in funeral flowers. I sat in the bedroom where Jerome had grown up. The walls were still painted a soft blue, faint traces of superhero stickers lingering from when he was little. The room hadn't changed much, but somehow everything was different. I stared at the old photos on the dresser. Jerome graduating from Penn State, smiling so wide his eyes narrowed. A wedding photo of Jerome and Renee at City Hall, Jerome holding his wife's hand, looking at her with complete trust. A picture from last Christmas, Jerome holding his nephew, cheek to cheek, both of them laughing like nothing else in the world mattered. But then I realized something that chilled my spine. There wasn't a single recent photo of Jerome and me. Not one. Not even a tiny frame. Could Renee have quietly removed them? Since when? Why? My absence from my own son's memories. That wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate choice. My heart tightened. A soft knock echoed at the door. Renee stood in the doorway. Her makeup was still flawless, but she was no longer pretending to wear that polite mask. The calculating look behind her dark mascara was now unmistakably visible, as if a spotlight were shining directly onto it. "We need to talk, Claudine." Just 4 words, yet they pierced my spine like 4 cold needles. I must admit, the funeral itself was beautiful, dignified, well orchestrated.
At Donahue Funeral Home in West Philadelphia, enormous floral wreaths framed almost the entire window. Jerome's favorite hymns drifted gently through the room. Even the reception afterward was immaculate. Triangular cut sandwiches, crisp white tablecloths, ironed to perfection. But what wasn't beautiful was the way Renee played the grieving widow with such meticulous calculation. She dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief, though her eyes stayed dry. She hugged guests as if she might collapse, yet still had the awareness to fix her hair whenever she thought no one was watching.
And every now and then, during conversations, she let slip little lines like, "Well, it's time to move forward." This is the start of a new chapter. Her husband had been dead for less than a week. How could someone move forward so quickly? While I stood in the receiving line, accepting condolences from Jerome's old friends, I accidentally overheard Renee speaking with her sister behind a large flower arrangement. "Just the life insurance alone covers 2 years of mortgage," Renee whispered, though not quietly enough for a grieving mother's ears to miss, "and we won't have those extra expenses anymore." Extra expenses? What did she mean? Was I, Jerome's mother, an expense? Her sister whispered, "And what about Claudine? Where will she go?" Then came Renee's laugh, small, sharp, cold as a blade slicing through glass. "That's not my problem anymore. She needs to take care of herself like every other adult." I froze. It felt like my entire body had been dipped into a barrel of ice water. I had lived with them for 2 years. Ever since selling my small home to help them with the down payment on this one, Jerome always said it was temporary until I found something more suitable. But temporary slowly turned into permanent, like a promise never fulfilled. I cooked dinner every night. I swept the porch. I did laundry. I kept the house warm and welcoming. I once believed I was part of this family. Turns out, I was just their unpaid maid. Or worse, an obligation they were eager to cut loose. Have you ever experienced a moment when just a few careless words tear the veil off every truth you've been desperately trying to believe? A moment when you finally understand that for years you were never truly seen as family, only as someone temporarily occupying space in their lives? That was exactly what I felt, standing in the middle of my son's funeral, hearing my daughter-in-law speak of me as something disposable. "Claudine!" Renee suddenly appeared beside me. In an instant, her expression shifted from icy detachment to the polished grace she used in public. "Can you help me in the kitchen? There are a few things we need to discuss." A polite invitation, carrying the scent of warning. At that moment, I had no idea I was stepping straight into the second storm. A storm far more vicious than the grief of losing my child. I followed Renee through the crowd of mourners, forcing a polite smile at a few neighbors and hugging my sister goodbye. She would be flying back to Baltimore the next morning. The scent of lilies, incense, and expensive perfume blended into a suffocating haze that made me want nothing more than to escape that living room as fast as possible. Renee opened the kitchen door, softly but decisively. And the moment it clicked shut behind us, her face shifted into something entirely different. No grief, no trace of a woman who had just lost her husband. Only the sharp, calculated clarity of someone who had already finished arranging every piece on the board. "I'll be direct," she said, her voice level and cool, like she was reading a financial report, not speaking to the mother of the man who had just been buried. "This house is under Jerome's name, which means it's mine now, and I need time and space to deal with my pain without complications." "Complications?" I repeated, fighting to keep my voice calm, even as it felt like a boulder had been shoved into my chest. "You living here, it's no longer appropriate, Claudine. I need privacy." Her words hit me like a slap. No hesitation, no mercy, no respect. "Renee, I understand you're grieving," I tried, "but surely we can—" "No." She cut me off with a flick of her hand, as though she were trimming a loose thread off a dress. "My decision is final. I'm giving you until tomorrow evening to pack your things. That's more than enough." Tomorrow evening, barely 24 hours right after my son's funeral. I stared at Renee, searching her face for even a flicker of the woman I once knew, the woman who used to call me Mom, who hugged me at Christmas when she heard my blood pressure had gone up, who sent me a Happy Mother's Day card the first year after the wedding. But that woman was gone. Standing in front of me now was someone cold as steel and sharp as a blade. "Where do you expect me to go?" My voice rasped, thin and cracked. Renee shrugged. A quick, weightless shrug, careless, dismissive, like she was tossing out an old piece of furniture. "You're an adult, Claudine. You'll figure it out." The icy indifference in her voice tightened my throat. A part of me wanted to scream, to slam my hand on the counter and demand to know if she had any shred of humanity left. But all I managed was a whisper. "Jerome would be horrified to hear you speak like this. Jerome is gone." Her voice was flat, solid, unmovable. "And the sooner you accept that, the better it will be for both of us." There are moments in life when you feel yourself detach, as if you're watching your own world crumble from somewhere far away, unable to stop any of it. People say losing a loved one is the deepest pain a person can feel. But I learned something else that day. Sometimes the cruelest blow comes not from the dead, but from the living, standing right in front of you. That night, I lay in the empty room that had once been Jerome's childhood bedroom. Streetlights filtered through the thin curtains, drawing flickering stripes across the ceiling. Philadelphia's nighttime sounds drifted in through the window, car horns from the avenue, Penn students laughing as they walked back to their dorms, the soft hiss of a SEPTA bus braking at the stop sounds. I had heard 1,000 times now felt foreign, as though they belonged to a world that no longer included me. I thought about the $40,000, the money I earned from selling my tiny Fishtown home, the home where I raised Jerome while my husband battled cancer. I had given every penny to Jerome and Renee for the down payment on this house. I remembered Jerome's promise. "Mom, it's just temporary. You'll have your own place soon. We'll take care of you." But taking care slowly turned into tolerating. I remembered Renee's expression whenever guests came over, the way she introduced me. "This is Claudine, my mother-in-law. She's staying with us for a bit." Staying with us for a bit. A harmless phrase on the surface, yet so full of distance, rejection, dismissal. And then 2 years passed. 2 years of cooking, cleaning, managing the house, keeping everything tidy and warm. A home I foolishly thought I belonged in. But turns out, the only place I existed was in my own imagination. Now, on the very night I buried my son, I was being pushed out of the house I helped pay for, and I finally understood. I had been nothing but an overstayed guest, an unwanted extra, a burden. Renee had been waiting for the perfect moment to discard. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly alone, utterly lost, and genuinely afraid for my own future. Little did I know. The worst was yet to come, and the humiliation Renee was preparing for me had only just begun. It took me nearly the entire afternoon to compress my life into 4 old suitcases and 2 soft, dented cardboard boxes. 67 years of living, letters, a few photo albums, my mother's scarf, the Christmas gifts Jerome gave me, were now reduced to objects that could fit into the trunk of an aging car. There is something brutally cold about realizing that decades of loving, living, and hoping can be compacted into a few square feet like this. Every time I folded a shirt or rolled up a blanket, I had to stop because my hands trembled uncontrollably. A part of me, the childish, naive, desperate part, kept waiting for Renee to step in, tap gently on the doorframe, and say something kind, or at least something that resembled human warmth. I spoke too harshly. "You can stay a few more weeks. We just buried Jerome. I'm sorry." But the house was silent as a tomb, and the thing I was waiting for never came. Exactly at 6 p.m. the next day, neither a minute early nor late, Renee appeared in the doorway. No knock, no asking if I was ready, no concern whatsoever for the final bit of privacy I had in this room. Her arms were folded across her chest, shoulders raised, chin tilted slightly upward. "It's time, Claudine." No condolences, no hesitation. Her voice struck the air like a judge's gavel delivering a sentence. I zipped the last suitcase shut. The sharp sound echoed through the room that suddenly felt too big, too empty to still be called home. I took one last look around 4 bare walls. No photos, no vase where I used to place fresh roses every weekend. No trace that I had ever lived here, ever cooked dinners for Jerome, ever folded blankets for Renee when she came home late from business trips. Maybe this room had never truly been mine. "You'll give me a few minutes to take the bags to the car?" I asked, trying to keep my voice soft. Renee nodded, but it wasn't permission. It felt like she was checking off an item on her to-do list. "I'll help." It wasn't an offer. It was an order. She wanted me gone, as fast as possible. Before I could change my mind, or worse, before I could notice something she didn't want me to see. We made 3 trips to the car in silence. A thin mist hung over Philadelphia after a light drizzle. The maples lining Spruce Street were dark and saturated, as if drawn with black ink. Cold air slipped through my thin coat, carrying the damp smell of wet pavement and a faint hint of smoke from somewhere in the neighborhood. On the final trip, as I placed the last box into the trunk, I turned to look at Renee. I didn't even know what I intended to say. Maybe a polite goodbye, maybe a question begging for the last scrap of kindness she might have left. But instead, I heard myself say something entirely different. "I know you're angry about something. I just wish you would tell me what I did wrong so I could fix it." My words came out sounding like a plea, even though I tried to hide it. Renee stared at me, her face motionless, her eyes empty like 2 polished stones. "You didn't do anything wrong, Claudine." She shrugged. "You just exist in my space, in my life. You're an obstacle. Jerome felt sorry for you, but I don't." Cruelty spoken plainly can sometimes feel easier to swallow than fake sweetness, as if the mask finally fell, exposing the person I had always feared was lurking beneath. "So that's what it is," I whispered. I placed my hand on the car door handle and rolled the window down just an inch, searching for air or courage or both. "At the very least, can you tell me when the will is being read? Jerome must have left something for me." Renee frowned, genuinely puzzled, as if I'd asked something completely absurd. "Why would he leave anything to you?" She rolled her eyes. "You weren't his wife, and you didn't contribute to this household financially." I almost laughed, a bitter, choking laugh that stayed stuck in my throat. $40,000. The money I had given them for the down payment on this very house money Renee had apparently forgotten, or rewritten in her mind into some kind of spontaneous, obligation-free gift. "Right," I said. I was foolish to think otherwise. I started the engine. When I turned onto the corner of the street, I looked back through the rearview mirror. Renee was still standing there, arms crossed, posture stiff and triumphant, like someone who had just completed a successful eviction. The house darkened behind me, the place I once called home, and the only place I could afford to go was the Hampton Inn in Center City, near the convention center. A strange, temporary place, but at least no one could throw me out the next day. I drove away, leaving behind not just a house, but an entire life crushed within a span of 24 hours. At the hotel, I booked exactly 1 week and hauled all my belongings up to room 512, a cold, soulless space decorated with the kind of cheap artwork you only ever find in temporary places. It smelled faintly of disinfectant mixed with the tired residue of half-finished dreams left behind by the hundreds of people who had stayed there before me. The room felt like a rest stop for those who had just suffered a shock, lost their direction, or were desperately trying to piece themselves back together. I sat down on the rough polyester blanket, feeling the prickly texture crawl up my arms. The dim yellow ceiling light cast my shadow against the mirror, mounted above the flimsy particle board desk. I stared at the face looking back at me. Who was that woman? A widow? A mother without a child? A 67-year-old woman with no home, and in the eyes of her only remaining relative, worth nothing. My shoulders slumped. The eyes in the mirror stared back, drained, yet not extinguished. And in the cold indifference of that hotel room, in the lighting that made my skin look even more sallow, something very small, very thin, began to quiver inside my chest. Not hope. I wasn't anywhere near that yet. Despair still sat heavy inside me like a stone. But something else was there sharper, clearer. A feeling I couldn't name then, but now I understand it was waiting. Not waiting for Renee to show me kindness again. Not waiting for someone to save me, but waiting for the truth. Something my instincts told me Renee did not know. Something that would change everything. On the 5th day at the hotel, I sat in the lobby sipping a cup of complimentary coffee that tasted as weak as diluted water. Through the tall glass windows, I watched people rushing by. Couples in a hurry, night shift workers, travelers dragging suitcases. Each person carried their own story, and for the first time since Jerome died, I wondered, is my life about to turn in a different direction? I didn't know. No one knew. But one thing I understood clearly: pain is sometimes the warning that a new door is about to open. 2 weeks passed, my savings dwindled, and sleep grew increasingly fragile. I had begun to grow accustomed to the loud air conditioner, to the flickering light that buzzed every time I flipped the switch, to the door in the next room slamming at 2 a.m. Then the call came. I had just changed my shirt, planning to go downstairs to ask if the hotel offered a discount for a 3rd week, when my phone rang. "Mrs. Mercer, this is Attorney Franklin Boyd from Boyd & Associates. I handle your son's legal matters." I recognized his voice immediately. "Yes, I remember. We met when Jerome and Renee were handling the house paperwork." "That's right. I'm calling to inform you that Jerome's estate documents are finalized. There will be a reading of the will next Tuesday at 2 p.m. in my office, located in the Philadelphia County Register of Wills. You are required to be present. You are required to be present." I shot upright, as if cold water had been thrown at my face. I think there must be a mistake. Renee said, "Mrs. Mercer," he interrupted gently but firmly, "I can only tell you what the will explicitly states. Jerome named you as one of the beneficiaries. I will see you on Tuesday." The call ended. I sat motionless, phone still in my hand, my heart beating slow and heavy. Jerome, my son, had left something for me. Maybe it was only a keepsake, his father's watch, or a childhood photo album. But whatever it was Jerome's wish, and this was something Renee could not control, could not erase, could not rewrite to suit her ambitions. I set the phone aside and exhaled slowly. That weekend, I spent hours on my old laptop searching for cheap rentals, a studio in South Philly, a tiny one-bedroom in West Philly, a dingy apartment in Fairmount with barely any windows. I calculated every cent. The hotel money would only last 1 more week. What remained of my savings had to be reserved for a deposit and first month's rent. My small pension and Social Security would have to stretch far more than I had ever planned. The more I searched, the thicker the fog of uncertainty grew around my future. Long nights passed with the hotel alarm clock ringing each hour like a cruel reminder, "You're old, Claudine, and you're alone." But even in that darkness, I couldn't stop thinking about Jerome. The dinners where my son sat in silence while Renee complained about everything under the sun. The moments Jerome looked at me with a flicker of sadness, as if he wanted to say something, but held it inside. The late nights when he said, "I'm busy," when in truth he was sitting alone on the porch, weighed down by something he couldn't name. Jerome knew. Not everything, but enough to see through Renee's glossy exterior. My son lacked the courage to speak the truth, or perhaps he simply didn't want to destroy the marriage he had fought so hard to maintain, and now, sitting in that lonely hotel room, I realized Jerome had prepared something for me, something Renee never expected, something that could change my entire life. At 1:45 p.m., I sat in the parking lot beside attorney Franklin Boyd's office building near City Hall, my hands gripping the steering wheel as if letting go might cause the entire world to slip out of my control. My heart beat in a strange rhythm, not quite fear, not quite hope, a chaotic mix that pressed heavily against my chest. That was when I saw Renee. She stepped out of a polished silver BMW, the door closing so quietly it barely made a sound, a level of finesse Renee loved to show off. She wore a form-fitting black dress, the kind of fabric so expensive that even sunlight slid across it like soft satin. I thought to myself that the dress alone probably cost as much as my entire month of bare minimum living expenses. Walking beside her was a man in a gray suit, eyes glued to his phone, as if his soul had been sucked into it. It wasn't until they came closer that I recognized him. Kelvin, her brother, a lawyer, a man I had never once seen smile unless he had just won a case. When I entered the reception area, Renee turned her head, and the expression on her face was something I would never forget. A mixture of disgust, confusion, and restrained anger. "What is she doing here?" Renee hissed at the receptionist, as though I had wandered into a forbidden zone. "Mrs. Mercer is here to attend the will reading," the receptionist replied, polite but firm. Renee narrowed her eyes. "Who? Which Mrs. Mercer?" The receptionist smiled, calm in a way that deserved admiration. "Both." Kelvin muttered something into Renee's ear, probably reminding her to keep it together, and only then did she swallow her fury, dragging Kelvin to the row of seats across from me, each of her steps hitting the floor as if she wanted to crush it. I sat down, folded my hands, and could feel Renee's glare stabbing into me from the opposite side of the room, but I was too tired to care. At exactly 2 p.m., the office door opened. Attorney Franklin Boyd walked out, steady and composed, like a man who had witnessed far too many family tragedies in his legal career. Neatly trimmed silver hair, glasses hanging from a cord around his neck, a polite smile, but eyes that were sharp and seasoned. He motioned for us to enter. We sat before a large mahogany table. The room carried the scent of aged wood, mixed with the crisp smell of newly opened envelopes, a scent I later realized was the smell of truths about to be revealed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice deep and weighted, "I know this is a difficult time, but Jerome was very clear about his wishes. I will read the entire will and then answer questions afterward." Renee immediately leaned forward, her fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles turned white. Kelvin opened a notebook, pen poised like he was ready to collect evidence against me. As for me, I sat still, calm, or at least trying to appear so. The first part of the will was exactly what I expected. Renee was to receive the house. Renee was to receive the car. Renee was to receive his retirement accounts. Renee was to receive all life insurance benefits. With each line Boyd read aloud, Renee nodded, small, satisfied nods, filled with self-importance. At one point, she even glanced at me, letting a tiny smile surface. "See? I'm the one Jerome chose." I remained silent. Then Boyd cleared his throat. His voice slowed. He placed the page down softly, so softly it sounded like a breath. And I knew. The important part was coming. The entire room tightened, shrinking into a closed, airless box. The clock on the wall ticked, tick, tock, as if counting down to the truth. In that moment, Jerome's face flashed before me. His warm smile, the tight hugs he gave me every time he came home. For the first time in weeks, something flickered inside me, thin as a thread. Hope. "However," Boyd continued, "Jerome included one final clause, added 3 months before his passing." The room fell silent. Renee froze mid-nod, her mouth parting slightly. Kelvin dropped his pen onto the table, and my heart seemed to stop. Boyd read, To my mother, Claudine Mercer, who provided the down payment for the house and never asked to be repaid, I leave the entire contents of safe deposit box E3537 at PNC Bank, Market Street branch, along with all accompanying documents. No one spoke for several seconds. No breathing. No movement. Then, "What safe deposit box?" Renee snapped, her voice sharp as a blade. "Jerome never said anything about a safe deposit box." Attorney Boyd lifted his gaze, looking directly at her. This was Jerome's personal asset, and he made it very clear. The entire contents belonged to his mother. Even I was surprised, but my surprise drifted through me gently like a breeze. Renee's, however, hit her like lightning, striking the pride she cherished most. "What's inside?" Kelvin demanded, voice cold and quick, the reflex of a lawyer searching for loopholes. "I don't know," Boyd replied. Jerome left strict instructions and designated Mrs. Claudine as the only person permitted to access it. Renee's face drained of color, not just anger, fear. "This is ridiculous. If there's anything valuable in there, it should be part of the estate. I'll sue." Boyd nodded slightly, unbothered, his calmness making Renee's tantrum look childish. "You certainly have the right to do so," he said. "But this clause is explicit. Jerome was fully coherent when he signed. I witnessed it myself." I asked quietly, "When did Jerome add this clause?" 3 months ago, February 15th, Boyd answered. "He came into the office specifically to add this item." February 15th. I remembered that evening vividly. Valentine's Day had just passed. Jerome was silent through dinner. Renee was complaining non-stop about the neighbor's dog barking at night. I thought my son was tired. Now I knew. He had been thinking planning. Renee shot up from her chair, snatching her purse. "Kelvin, let's go. We're contesting this." But Boyd wasn't finished. "Before you leave," he said, pulling out a thick envelope, "Jerome left specific instructions for his mother regarding access to the box." He placed it into my hands. "Mrs. Mercer, these are the bank forms and Jerome's personal key. The bank will require the death certificate and will handle the procedure. It usually takes about 3 business days." Renee stared at the envelope as if it were prey she wanted to attack but couldn't reach. "I'll go with her," Renee declared. "You cannot," Boyd replied instantly. "Access is restricted to Mrs. Claudine Mercer alone. Bank policy." The room went dead silent, heavy as stone. Kelvin looked at his sister, his expression serious. Renee sat frozen. No more shouting, no more attacking. Only fear, and the unmistakable sting of losing. And in that moment I knew this story was only beginning. 3 business days passed at a pace so slow it felt deliberately designed to torture my nerves. Every morning I woke up in that cold hotel room, eyes open on the ceiling, wondering, what did Jerome leave behind? A keepsake? A single piece of paper? Or something bigger? I didn't dare hope for much. The emotions of a woman who'd been thrown out of her home and had just lost her son didn't allow room for anything more than the faintest glimmer of possibility. But there was something, a fragile, thin heartbeat inside my chest that pulled me up from bed each morning. On the 3rd day, after submitting the death certificate and signing every required bank document, I finally stood in front of safe deposit box E3537 inside the vault of the PNC Bank on Market Street, right in the bustling center of Philadelphia. The bank outside was busy, the clicking of money-counting machines, the hiss of automatic doors opening and closing, footsteps tapping across marble floors. But inside the vault, the space was cold, silent, another world entirely. The branch manager, Mrs. Lorna Shields, was waiting for me. She laid a gentle hand on my arm, as if afraid to startle me. "I'm very sorry for your loss. Let me take you downstairs." Her voice was soft, sincere, the kind that makes you feel seen and understood, even when you haven't spoken at all. I knew immediately that she had been briefed beforehand, probably by Attorney Boyd himself. We passed through 2 heavy steel doors, Electronic locks beeped sharply in the chilled quiet of the vault inside. The fluorescent lights reflected off long rows of safe deposit boxes, like hundreds of sleeping secrets. "Box 3537 is one of our larger units," she said, as she used the master key. "Your son rented it about 5 years ago, and he checked on it quite often." I froze. 5 years? Jerome had been preparing something. For 5 years? My heart tightened. Pain, pride, and regret blending into something almost unbearable. How had I not seen anything? Not a clue. Not a whisper. We inserted both keys at once, and the long steel drawer slid out, so heavy I had to use both hands to lift it. The cold metal seeped into my skin, making me shiver. "Take your time," Mrs. Shields said softly, guiding me into a private viewing room. "I'll be right outside." The door closed, and I sat alone in the small, windowless room. The stark white light overhead made everything look solemn, almost like an interrogation chamber. I took a breath, set the box on the table, and opened the lid. The first thing I saw was a letter, addressed to me, written in the handwriting I had known for 45 years. My whole world slowed to a stop as I picked it up. My hands trembled so badly the edge of the paper quivered. I opened it, and the first line tore my heart in half. "Dear Mom, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer in this world." I covered my mouth to stifle the sob that almost escaped. Jerome wrote, "And Renee has probably already shown you exactly who she really is." I stopped. My heart burned, not only from the truth, but from imagining the pain my son endured in silence. Jerome continued, "You're wondering why I didn't say anything, or why I didn't leave. The answer is complicated, Mom. I once loved Renee, or at least, I loved the person I thought she was." I closed my eyes, remembering the nights Jerome sat quietly, the forced smile, the apologetic glance he gave me whenever Renee made some cruel comment. Maybe all of those were signs I didn't dare examine too closely. I kept reading. This past year, I finally understood she wasn't going to change. I saw the messages she sent to her sister about you, heard the conversations she whispered to Kelvin about the Claudine problem, and I knew, the moment I wasn't here anymore, you would have no home. Tears dropped onto the page, blurring the ink. Jerome knew all along, and he prepared. So I made a plan. I set the letter down, inhaled deeply, then opened the rest of the box. Inside was a thick stack of documents, neatly organized, labeled meticulously. Just from the first glance, I understood. Jerome didn't just leave money. He left protection. He left vindication. He left a plan for the war he knew I'd have to fight alone. I continued reading the letter. "You gave us $40,000 for the down payment on the house. I've invested that money over the past 5 years. This isn't repayment. It's the result of careful investing." I opened the folder. Account statements, investment records, portfolio summaries. All in my name. A number stared back at me like a bolt of lightning. $185,000. I blinked. Read again. Counted the digits. Everything. Mine. Legally. Completely separate from Renee. I had to steady both hands on the table just to remain upright. Jerome wrote, "You never knew I paid the entire mortgage from my salary. You were never a burden, no matter what she said. You were never a burden." At that point, I couldn't read through the tears. It took me several minutes to continue. In a folder labeled Documents, Jerome wrote, "I documented everything. Messages, emails, every insult she made about you. You need to know who you lived with." I opened the folder, and there they were. Texts mocking me, emails with Kelvin, screenshots of her credit card statements, her complaints about me to her sister, and plans, literal plans, to kick me out of the house. Everything. Like watching a movie of my own life, a movie I never realized was being filmed. And at the bottom of the letter, Jerome wrote, "You deserve a better life. Use this money to build a place that belongs to you. And Mom, don't tell Renee anything until you are far away from her. All my love, Jerome." I clutched the letter to my chest, sobbing, not because of the money, not because of the evidence, but because of love, the love of a son who saw the cruelty I endured and prepared to save me from it. When I left the viewing room nearly an hour later, I was not the same woman who had walked in, no more trembling, no more uncertainty. I was a woman with purpose. Mrs. Shields helped me gather the documents into a large envelope, explained the next steps for accessing the account. I thanked her and left the bank, warm golden sunlight spilling over Market Street like honey. And then my phone rang. "Renee," I answered. Her voice, sweet enough to curdle milk. "Claudine, darling, would you like to have lunch together? We could discuss what you found in the safe deposit box." I stared at my reflection in the car window. No fear, no hesitation, only the calm of someone who already knew the truth. "How generous of you, Renee. I'll be there, right at noon." It was time for Renee to learn a lesson life keeps trying to teach people like her. Never underestimate a mother, especially one her son chose to protect even after he was gone. I arrived at Renee's house, or rather, her house now, exactly at noon. I parked at the curb and sat for a moment, watching the familiar brick facade that had once felt like a shared home, and now felt like a stage where the last act was about to play. In my hand was a small gift bag, and on my face was the kind of poker smile that would make even seasoned card players nod with respect. On the inside, though, my heart was steady in a way it hadn't been in weeks. I rang the bell. Renee opened the door wearing a billowy white dress that probably cost as much as my entire hotel bill from the previous month. The fabric floated around her like she was the star of some lifestyle commercial. The kind where grief looks glamorous and no one ever has to check their bank balance. Her face lit up with a warmth so fake it could have frosted a cake. "Claudine, I'm so glad you came. I made your favorite chicken salad." How amusing. After all these years, she suddenly remembered my favorite dish, but only now, when she wanted something from me. Not when I was doing dishes in her kitchen, not when I was packing my life into boxes. Only now, when there might be money involved. She stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and roasted chicken, a carefully curated combination of homely and respectable hostess. The same hallway, the same pictures, the same staircase, but everything felt different. The dining table was set with wedding china, fresh flowers, and crystal glasses. Even the napkins were folded into neat little shapes. Renee had prepared for this performance so meticulously it was almost embarrassing, like watching someone rehearse grief in front of a mirror. She led me to the table and gestured for me to sit. "Iced tea?" she offered, already pouring before I even answered. I nodded. "Sure." She poured iced tea, let a slice of lemon drop in with a soft splash, and placed the glass in front of me like we were two old friends catching up. Then she started with the small talk. The weather, traffic near City Hall, how busy things had been since Jerome's passing. I simply sat there, watching her circle around the topic she really wanted to reach. It was like watching a shark swim lazy circles before finally moving in for the kill. Finally, she set her glass down and sat up straight. "So, the safe deposit box. Have you looked at it?" "I have." I calmly sipped my tea, letting the ice clink against the glass. Renee flashed a gentle smile so sweet it curdled the air. "I know we've had some misunderstandings, but Jerome would want us to support each other. We're family." Family. What a flexible little word for the woman who kicked me out the day after her husband's funeral. "I completely agree," I said. Her eyes brightened. She thought she had me hooked. "Wonderful. I'm glad you understand. And, regarding what Jerome left you, we could combine resources. I have excellent financial advisors. We could invest together." I almost laughed. The audacity would have been impressive, if it weren't so pathetic. What makes you think the box contained anything valuable, Renee? She blinked, caught off guard. Well, Jerome was very private about money. He must have kept something important. Private, I echoed. An interesting choice of word. Renee waved her hands lightly, as if brushing away something inconvenient. You know what I mean. Men never tell us everything. I set my fork down, the soft clink somehow louder than it should have been. I think Jerome told you exactly what he wanted you to know. For the first time since I arrived, a flicker of worry crossed Renee's eyes, a tiny crack in the porcelain mask. What did you find in the box? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I lifted the gift bag I'd brought and gently placed it in front of her. I brought you something. Renee opened it with the excitement of a child on Christmas morning. Inside was a beautifully framed photo of Jerome on his college graduation day. Cap slightly crooked, smile broad and hopeful. Her face softened. Oh, Claudine, thank you. This is so meaningful. I thought you deserved it, I said softly. You were such a devoted wife. The way I emphasized devoted made her flinch. Just a tiny jerk of the eye, a fleeting tightening of her jaw, but I caught it. What do you mean by that? Nothing, I smiled. I simply admire how you took care of my son. The atmosphere chilled instantly, like someone had opened a freezer door right there in the dining room. Renee set the frame down, her back straightening like a cat sensing danger. Claudine, you're speaking in circles. What did you find in the safe deposit box? Mostly documents, I said lightly. Her fingers tightened around her glass. What documents? Financial records? Investment statements? I paused, watching her, and a lot of printed emails, text messages. Renee's face drained of color. Messages? What messages? Messages you sent your sister, for example. I took out my phone and opened a photo David had taken in the bank viewing room. Want to see? This one is from 6 months ago. I held the screen toward her. God, I wish that old woman would leave. I want to turn her room into my gym. There it was, in black and white. Her words, her heart. Renee lunged to grab the phone, but I slid it back with effortless ease. Not aggressively, just firmly, the way a mother might move something breakable out of reach of a child. There are dozens, Renee, I said calmly. Messages you sent Kelvin about pushing Jerome to demand I pay household expenses, even though the mortgage was paid straight from his salary. Stop, she whispered, voice barely audible. And emails where you mocked me to your sister, I continued, my tone still conversational, calling me easy to manipulate, easy to toss out, and just a burden. I set the phone down, folded my hands, and looked directly at her. You planned to get rid of me long before Jerome died. For a second, the room felt utterly silent. No hum from the fridge, no passing cars, no distant city noise, just the sound of two women breathing on opposite sides of a table covered in fine china. Renee's mask shattered completely at her own dining table. He had no right to save private messages, she snapped. Oh, he had every right, I replied softly. It was his house. And you were talking about his mother. I leaned back slightly, not threatening, just steady. The question isn't why he saved them. It's what we're going to do with them. Renee swallowed hard, her throat working. What do you want? I don't want anything from you, I said. I never have. Then why are you doing this? Why humiliate me? You humiliated yourself, I said softly. You threw me out the day after your husband's funeral. You told people I was useless, that I contributed nothing. Did you think Jerome was blind? Renee clutched the edge of the table as if it might keep her from drowning. I love Jerome, she stammered. You loved what Jerome provided, I replied. Not the same thing. Renee began to cry, mascara streaking down her cheeks in 2 black rivers. The image might have been tragic, if I didn't know how carefully those tears were usually weaponized. I can't lose everything. I can't go back to being nobody. You're not nobody, I said evenly. You're Jerome's widow. You inherited a $500,000 house, a $200,000 insurance policy, retirement accounts. If you manage things well, you'll be comfortable for life." "But that's not enough for the life I want," she burst out. There it was, the truth, the core of the whole thing. I stood, picking up my purse, letting the chair scrape softly against the floor. "Then perhaps you planned the wrong life." I paused at the doorway and took a slow breath. Behind me was a woman collapsing under the weight of her own greed, tears, panic, ego cracking right there between the flower centerpieces and the expensive china. Ahead of me was daylight and a new life opening wide. The house itself felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to choose the ending. "Claudine, please wait!" Renee shot up from her seat, the chair tipping dangerously. "We can fix this. I'm begging you." I turned back. "What exactly do you want to fix?" "The money, our relationship, everything." I looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her. The smeared mascara, the shaking hands, the woman who had everything and still thought she had nothing. Then I spoke gently. "You're worried about the money because you know how you've been spending it." I reached into my purse and pulled out the final document, the one Jerome had left for the end, as if he knew this scene would play out almost exactly like this. "This is your last monthly expense report. $15,000, spa treatments, designer clothes, weekend trips to New York, all while you told Jerome you were stressed about buying groceries." Renee fell silent, stunned. Her mouth opened, then closed again, searching for a defense that wouldn't sound ridiculous. I was under pressure." "Pressure from what?" I glanced around the pristine, magazine-perfect home with its curated decor and color-coordinated cushions. "Pressure to live lavishly on Jerome's dime?" She lowered her head, tears dripping onto the tablecloth. "I don't want to lose this life." "Jerome gave you everything," I said, "but he didn't give you permission to demean his mother." For a moment, neither of us spoke. It struck me then. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I didn't even feel angry anymore. Just finished. I opened the door. "Goodbye, Renee." She called after me, voice cracking with panic. "Claudine, please don't leave." I looked back one last time. Jerome already paved the way for me. I'm simply following it. And I walked out of that house without needing to look back. This time, I didn't feel like I was being pushed out. This time, I was the one choosing to leave, carrying with me the one thing Renee could never touch, the proof that my son had loved me enough to protect me even after death. I walked away from Renee, leaving her alone in that elegant dining room, surrounded by wedding china, crystal glasses, and the carefully curated life she had staged like a theater set. Behind those walls, the silence felt heavy, almost echoing with all the things she had lost, some by tragedy, but most by her own choices. And I stepped outside, straight into the sunlight, into the beginning of my own new life. Sometimes, the best revenge is no revenge at all. Sometimes, justice simply arrives at the right time for the right person in the exact way it was meant to. And sometimes, the universe waits patiently until the truth can rise on its own. 3 months later, I stood at Jerome's grave in Laurel Hill Cemetery, laying a fresh bouquet of white lilies, his favorite, on my son's tombstone. The cemetery overlooked the Schuylkill River, and it was one of those beautiful spring days in Philadelphia when the whole world seems washed clean. The kind of day Jerome always loved, when the air felt crisp, the breeze gentle, and everything whispered, "Things will get better, Mom." I knelt, brushing my fingers across the smooth stone. "Hello, my boy," I murmured, placing my hand on the cold granite. "I just wanted to say thank you, not just for the money, though it changed my life, but for seeing me, for protecting me, even when you weren't here anymore." The wind rustled through the old oak trees on the hill. A single leaf drifted down and landed at my feet like a quiet blessing. For a brief moment, I could almost hear Jerome's voice beside me, warm, mischievous, steady. "You'll be okay, Mom. You always are." It wasn't imagination, not really. It was a son's love, echoing in all the ways that matter after life. With the money Jerome left me, I bought a small, cozy apartment in Chestnut Hill. Nothing fancy. Just a 2-bedroom place with soft morning light, wooden floors, and windows overlooking a park where children played after school. But most importantly, it was mine. A place where no one could ever knock on the door, fold their arms, and tell me, "Time's up, you have to go." A place where I could breathe. I bought a second-hand sofa, painted the walls a pale yellow, and planted herbs on the windowsill. For the first time in years, I woke up feeling safe. And belonging to myself again, I also began volunteering at a local organization helping older women find housing. Women who had been pushed out, overlooked, dismissed, or quietly erased by the people they loved most. Because I knew what it felt like to be 67 years old with nowhere to go, lying in a strange hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering, do I still matter to anyone? Is this how my story ends? I never wanted another woman to go through that alone. There's something strange about pain. If you survive it, it becomes a key that opens doors for others. And the day I sat with those women in the community room sharing my story, I realized something powerful. My tears had not been wasted. My suffering had meaning. There was purpose in the path I survived. Some of the women cried with me. Some held my hands. All of them understood the loneliness I carried, because it echoed their own. And in their eyes, for the first time in months, I saw something reflected back at me. Strength. The strength I didn't even realize I had. And Renee? I heard she had to sell the Spruce Street house, the mortgage far too heavy without Jerome's income. The bills kept coming, and the lifestyle she had curated so carefully simply collapsed under its own weight. She moved into a much smaller apartment out in the suburbs, one without the chandeliers, the walk-in closets, the perfect dining room she used to perform her perfect life in. I didn't feel triumphant. Truly, I didn't. Success built on someone else's downfall isn't success at all. In fact, I almost felt sorry for her. Renee once had everything: a good husband, a beautiful home, a mother-in-law who only wanted to be included, not worshipped, and a future filled with security. But she never saw the value in any of it. She was too busy chasing an image, a perfect shell that no one, no matter how wealthy, can hold on to forever. I touched Jerome's tombstone again, smiling through quiet tears. "My son was far better than she ever deserved," I whispered. "But you knew that already, didn't you? That's why you protected me." As I left the cemetery, warm spring sunlight brushed across my face. For the first time since Jerome passed, I felt something I thought I'd never touch again. Hope, soft, gentle, steady hope. Not just hope born from financial stability, though that certainly made breathing easier. But hope because I remembered something I had forgotten along the way. My worth was never tied to how useful I was. Not to how clean the dishes were. Not to how many meals I cooked. Not to whether I fit into someone else's idea of a good mother-in-law. My worth came from who I am. A mother who loved her son with everything she had, and who was loved deeply enough in return that he protected her, even from beyond death. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. Stories like this remind us of what truly matters. Not money, not perfection, but love and loyalty within a family. And if your parents are still alive, call them today. Tell them you love them. Because one day, sooner than you expect, you would give anything for just one more phone call. Thank you for listening until the very end. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you have a story of your own, share it in the comments. Your voice always matters.